Well, hello everyone around the world, and welcome to another episode of the IEEE Power and Energy Society Student Podcast. This is our monthly conversation with guests that inspire us, that speak from experience, and drive innovation. I'm your host, Clinton Gadet. I'm a third year electrical engineering student at BCIT in Vancouver, Canada. And on the screen today with us are our producers, editors, and administrators extraordinaire, Adamir and Paul, as well our director of marketing and social media, Priya Mana, and our mentors and executive producers, Hasala Dharmawardena and Conrad Schmidt. So, as always, this podcast is made for you guys, the students watching, and the young professionals around the world. So please be brave, ask your questions in the chat, or ask to be unmuted and speak with us directly. This is what it's for. It's for you. So please participate. Don't be shy. Um, so that's pretty much it for the intro as well. Without further ado, it is an honor to introduce our guest this evening, Bill Nussey. How are you, sir? Bill, not sir, just Bill.
Yeah, good evening. I'm really flattered to be here. This is such an exciting time for all of us in the engineering world, and hopefully we can get some great stories and discussions going because I've been an engineer for most of my life, not a practicing engineer, but I'm sort of becoming one again. This is a great time and very flattered to be part of your discussion tonight.
It's great to have you. Well, we'll give everyone a little bio of you, just to brief over. And so Bill Nussey is the founder of the Freeing Energy Project, whose mission is to accelerate the shift to cleaner, cheaper energy, and the co-founder of Solar Inventions, whose mission is to accelerate the pace of innovation in solar and other clean energy solutions. Prior to his current work, Bill spent most of his career as tech CEO and entrepreneur. He co-founded his first company in high school, which provided graphic softwares to early text-based personal computers. His second company was started out of his college dorm room and ultimately sold business software across 45 countries. After several years as a venture capitalist with Greylock, he left the firm to run a portfolio company, which took public and grew to almost $500 million in revenue. And Bill's journey into clean energy began with a TED Talk, which grew into 100 articles, and most recently, a top 10 energy podcast called the Freeing Energy Podcast. All of this supported and ultimately led to his upcoming book called Freeing Energy, which is what Bill has been promoting today, and recently it came out 4 or 5 weeks ago. So this book was supported by 320 interviews across the world. And the book's mission is to help readers understand a powerful new approach to accelerating the shift to green energy. So, welcome, Bill.
It's a mouthful. Thank you again. Really honored to be here.
Yeah, so what we usually like to delve into when guests come on is to see where they started and how they got where they are, and provide some insight and some context to people who might be in the position you might have been years ago. So, like I mentioned, you started a company in high school. How did that? How?
You know, this was a long time ago, right? And so there was nobody doing companies in high school back then. It was the kind of thing where people thought you were kind of crazy. Like I've become a circus clown in high school. It was just something that didn't make a lot of sense, but the motivation was actually really simple. I have had and have absolutely no athletic ability, which is matched only by my lack of interest in athletics. And uh, and so I decided there was this computer in the library, and it was sort of interesting. And I started poking on it, and turned out it was the most interesting thing I'd ever seen technically, and I fell in love with computers and was good at them. And back when there was nobody anywhere that understood anything about computers. I mean, this was back before Bill Gates started Microsoft, and turns out that uh, being a computer nerd was one of the first generation where that was actually a positive thing to be. And then I discovered, at the risk of being a little bit inappropriate, but I discovered that I couldn't throw a ball and I wasn't particularly good looking or charming. But running my own company in high school, I was able to be interesting to the folks that I was interested in hanging around with. Some young women found that a fascinating story, and then I just said, "Wow, if I can do this business thing and talk to girls, well, that's really a powerful story." So that was probably half my motivation, was just to finally get a date with somebody. So I
Yeah,
had something to talk about.
yeah, your motivations as a young man are definitely different than as you get older. And so that journey from did you go from that company directly into the business world, or did you go into academics?
Oh, so I did that company in high school, and we were selling software for a very old computer called the TRS-80, which is came out at the same time as the more famous Apple II came out. And I fell in love with business. I love technology, but my business partner in high school was better at it than me, and so I was more the business guy. I fell in love with it, and so went up to college, NC State, to get a double E degree. Thought I was going to build robots. That was my whole plan, and I got there, and a friend of mine, a guy I knew from high school, found me one day. Says, "I have this idea for a computer software company. I know you've done it before." And he said, "Nobody really likes me, and everyone kind of likes you, so you should be the CEO." And that's how I got to be a CEO, and I've kind of been stuck in that job my whole career. But we started this company and invited a few other folks, and some great funny stories about how we found our first customers. But the company took off, and it ultimately went from doing custom programming, uh, doing a inventory management for a book seller down the street, that kind of thing, to writing commercial software, which is what really launched the business onto the international stage and ultimately led it to selling software in 45 countries, which is some fun stories. We were one of the first software companies anywhere. We were one of the first U.S. software companies to sell software into Japan, into the Middle East, into Russia, the USSR at the time. So really interesting. Went to some of those places, and was eye-opening for a kid in college or just out of college.
No doubt. What was some of the hardest things to learn about being a CEO, managing people and big decisions?
Wow. I think when I was younger, I really thought it was all about the product, and without a good product, you don't have a company. Well, that's not always true. Uh, but in most cases, you have to have a good product to have a company. But the work beyond that, the people side of it, coordinating and aligning people, uh, if you have investors, managing them, managing customers, meeting their expectations and dealing it with when occasionally you don't. Those are the people side of it is hard. And I was not wired for that. I'm kind of an introvert, to be honest. And so raising my game to be the face of the company, to be the deal closer, was really, really hard. And it was sheer necessity. I figured it out.
Yeah, as like so sort of a trial by fire, like who teaches you to be CEO? There's not enough of them really out there to be teaching kids fresh out of high school.
Back then there weren't. I mean, I could tell you stories. Like we went to my first trade show, and there was a company in our town that was also going to the same trade show in Las Vegas, and they were kind of our mentors. We were in our early 20s, and they were adults with children, and we didn't really understand much of what that meant. But the day we got to the trade show, they sat us down and they explained to us, here's what you need to do. You need to get people drunk. You need to get them so drunk, and then you get them to sign contracts while they're drunk. And we're sitting there taking notes, right? Okay, get them drunk. But we're like, I can't drink much. I don't drink much, and I'm going to get, well, you have to really learn and practice to drink a lot, so you have to be the less drunk person. And this was serious advice. And I was 22 years old. Who knew? It turned out to be very bad advice. I didn't take it. But we
Yeah.
had a lot of people who were happy to give us advice. Most of it was bad. And we just sort of turned ourselves into hardcore learners. But I work with a lot of people that age now doing startups, and there's so many great resources. It's just a very different world.
Yeah. When was the moment that you realized you were starting to differentiate from being just in the mix to being really successful and possibly bought by a larger company or going public? Or do
Well,
you
it's two
remember
different
what
different
that moment
questions.
was?
I'm genuinely, I don't want to sound disingenuous, but I'm really working on being successful still. And I know so many people that have a degree of success that eclipses anything I'll ever achieve. So I kind of hold success, however you measure it, by impact, by recognition, by wealth. I'm surrounded by people who have made amazing strides in those areas, and I have the ambition to do some of what they've done. But we were in the company for many years before it even occurred to us that we might have an exit. And we had, as they say, kissed a lot of frogs to find the prince. And there's stories from those of us back in our 20s when we had a deal, and I actually had them through my whole career. I've had one as recently as 5 years ago, where the deal is ready to go and everyone's shaking hands, and the lawyers are all teed up, the contract's finished, and then hours before it's supposed to close, something changes and the whole thing falls apart. And I've had a lot of those, and I've talked to some people, and sometimes the deal just happens. But people that have done a lot of deals, like I have sold and bought a lot of companies, they're usually full of a lot of soul-crushing, heart-wrenching, uh, holy cow, I can't believe how bad this is situations. And it's I think it's a little bit for me like the first time I fell in love, and when it didn't work out, I thought my life was over. And then I fell in love later in my life, and it didn't work out, and I realized, I am not a person. I mean, I am a person independent of who I love or whether I'm in love, and I realized that I could build great companies whether someone wanted to buy them or not, whether we were super profitable or not. You still could be very proud of the companies, and that was hard to learn, but surviving some heartaches really helped get through it. So it's a hard lesson, but it
No
works.
doubt. And and I guess for lots of the people watching today, we're getting there, everyone. But how did you go from the world of business and CEO, and there was a stint as a venture capitalist in there as well. How did you transition into a clean energy advocate and freeing energy and local energy? When did that curiosity first start? Is my first question.
Well, if you'll indulge me, let me just give you a quick arc of my career because it explains how I got there.
Of
Uh,
course.
I realized when I was pretty young, when I was in my 20s, that the thing that made me happy, and I don't know if I'm the only person or there's other people like this, but I realized the thing that makes me happy fundamentally is when I'm learning. Not classroom learning, don't like that so much, but when I'm growing and developing, my skills are getting better. And so all the career decisions I've made have been formed by where am I going to learn the most? And I'd say about half the time, half the decisions I've made, the general consensus was they were mistakes. They all worked out great, by the way, but my metric hasn't been how much money I'm getting paid or what my title is or anything like that. It's always been where am I going to learn the most. And that led me to, I ran a company, which was one of the early software as a service companies for marketing tech or digital marketing. And we grew it to about 100 million in revenue, recurring revenue, and had 5,000 clients, big brands, And IBM actually had several people that were going to buy it, and it didn't come through. Another more of those heartaches, but they weren't meant to be. And we always knew that IBM was a great fit for this particular company for a lot of reasons. They had a huge hole in their offering, and so long story short, IBM ended up acquiring us, and so we were just under 1,000 people and a 450,000 person company, kind of lost, and I was very frustrated. So one day, I wrote a letter to the CEO of IBM, who's this amazing business person, Ginny Rometty. She's recently retired. And I just told her in this letter how absolutely dumb IBM was, how they were squandering the opportunity. But I remembered this famous story I heard about Abraham Lincoln, is you write that letter and then you stick it in a drawer and or you throw it away. So I wrote three more versions of that letter. And the one that reached her was, look what IBM could be. And I felt much better about it. It wasn't as cathartic, but I had already gotten that catharsis out and stuck it in the drawer. And long story short, about 7 or 8 weeks later, I was running strategy for IBM. That's a funny story we don't have time for, but so here I was helping the CEO and the SVPs determine where IBM needed to go for the next set of years. Had a great team of folks. It was a fun job. And IBM is an amazing organization, full of faults, but it is an amazing organization. And one of the projects we were working on was building out IBM's IoT, Internet of Things offering, which we helped launch that division. And we were looking at part of that project for strategy was to look at every single industry in the United States and assess it for its IoT potential. And now I'm a double E, but I hadn't practiced it in a long time. And but I knew a little bit about grids and electricity enough to be dangerous. And here I started looking. The team brought me the power industry, and we're looking at it like this is an amazingly large existing industry that is shockingly little digitization, shockingly little. I mean, it has so little IoT or old conventional versions of IoT even. And so it got my attention. I started looking at it, then became interesting personally, because outside of the potential for IBM, I realized that something absolutely profound was about to occur. And this was in 2014, 15. Absolutely game changing was about to occur, and that solar was about to become the least expensive way to generate electricity in the history of humanity, cheaper than anything else. And I knew, and I think in hindsight it was right, that this was going to begin one of the largest disruptions in global business. and it's just now starting, and many people don't see it, but it is underway. And it's not just solar, as I discovered, it's also small scale solar, which we can talk about. But I fell in love with this industry for really three reasons. Uh, I wanted to do something that really mattered at a broad scale in the world. So there were three things I was looking for. The first was I felt some urgency about the planet, not just climate change, which is pretty terrible, but just pollution in general. I've discovered and learned that the amount of pollution from the power industry is absolutely amazing and bad. Second, I had learned that I had visited Africa, East Africa on a vacation, and it was amazed at how difficult it was for these families to light their homes with fires and kerosene, how expensive it was. And I knew there had to be a better answer. And I wanted to do something to help. And the third was I wanted to do something that was going to create great businesses, something that was going to make a lot of money. And so what I discovered was this path towards smaller solar and small scale solar specifically, small scale solar and batteries now, was going to check all those three boxes. And I just had to be in it, just had to be in it.
I I would like to explore that avenue of solar. What was the prognosis when that around that time, and what is the prognosis right now? What is it? What as far as cost and accessibility and ease of use and appeal? It's a kind of a cultural thing too, as well. That it has to be a shift of people not being afraid of it, or it not being a burden or too much friction.
Every time I see someone build a new home or a new building and it doesn't have solar, which is virtually all the time, I just I sigh because it would actually be cheaper. And it's just the people's awareness of the costs, the lack of burden, the lack of trouble that it requires. It's just it's amazing, and it's actually unfortunately gotten even worse because it's in some ways become politicized, at least in the
Yeah,
U.S. Not
yeah.
so much in Europe and Asia, but there is a wide amount of misinformation. There's a whole chapter in my book where I just use hard research and data to take apart some of the prevailing myths that are just fundamentally wrong about renewable energy, just fundamentally 180 degrees wrong. And, the energy industry is the largest industry on the planet Earth, and it is arguably the most powerful. And while I've met many people, many top executives in the energy industry, and they're not these Mr. Burns from Homer Simpson's where they, they're people think they're doing a great job, but they're part, and they believe in what they're doing, but they're part of a system that was designed 100 years ago for a different world. And so they think the best thing to do is to perpetuate the system that was created 100 years ago. And so what happens is we're stuck in this this bad movie playing over and over again, and it's very difficult to change it. And so it's exciting to see what's about to start happening. And I think the disruption is raising the lowering prices, raising people's attention. So I have this chart I have all the time, and I promise not to give you PowerPoints today, but it starts off with the price of solar back when it was like $10, $12 a watt to put on your house. And the only reason people did that was for they were environmental. They wanted to reduce their carbon footprint. Then you got to the stage where we're at now with the addition of subsidies. Solar is generally cheaper than any other way to generate electricity, and the price has come down steadily. And it has dropped. The price of solar, for example, has dropped 400 times since it was first put up on to use to power satellites in the 60s and 70s.
Wow.
And what's really interesting is that while the price of solar cells and panels will continue to come down, the price of installing solar is going to come down even more. So if you think about like a small scale solar system, like a rooftop or a small commercial system, those panels are only going to be about 10 to 20% of that cost. And so here's a fascinating statistic about where it's going. Today, if you put rooftop solar on your house, it's going to be about $3 a watt in the US. So you put up a 4 kilowatt system, it's $12,000. If you put up a commercial system, it's going to be $2.50 a watt. These numbers are published everywhere. You can look them up 5 different places. They're pretty commonly known. If you were to build that exact same system with the exact same parts, same brands, same SKU numbers, and build it in Australia, that system is going to be $1.10 a watt.
Mm.
And the reason is red tape and bureaucracy.
Mm.
And Australia decided that they wanted to streamline the people having solar in their country. So, and again, these numbers are available everywhere, but no one looks at it. No one says, well, if Australia is buying the same parts and they have similar rooftops, and this has nothing to do with how sunny it is, it's just to install the solar, how come they're 3 times cheaper? And so when you hear things like the cost of solar is going to drop by half, some people roll their eyes. Well, it couldn't possibly do that. Well, Australia is already a third of the cost. And that's even if panels never go down a dime, which they're going to go down tremendously. So there are so many factors pointing to the second part of your question, Clinton. The price of solar is going to continue to plummet. And when we go out about 7 to 10 years, it's going to be half. If you're in places that are with moderate solar, like I live in Georgia or maybe the Midwest in the United States, not so much in Canada, but the price of solar will be half the cost of electricity from the grid. Half.
Wow. Veronice Lopez in the chat would like to know, why have the prices dropped?
Say that again.
We
Why
have
have
someone in the
prices
chat.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. So
Well,
that's
you don't
this
you
is
don't have to read the chat. We'll try and bring it into this. So don't worry about it. But yes, that's the question.
you broke up when you asked the question, so I didn't hear what
Okay.
you said. I get it now. That's a great question. There's an entire chapter in my book on it. That's when I decided at IBM that I was going to go do this. It was predicated that the price of solar would continue to go down, and I had been studying technology curves as a nerd, as a hobbyist since microchip, since the 8088 microchip, and when hard drives, disk drives were 5 megabytes was considered huge, and these technologies are incredibly predictable in terms of the cost declines, irrespective of installation of solar panels, just the underlying technology. And so I studied this for probably a year, and I talked to some of the top solar scientists in the world. I have hundreds and hundreds of spreadsheets with costs and models, and I found the same thing that the experts were finding, and all the experts will tell you the same thing, that it's manufacturing quantities. The same reason your iPhone is twice as good and or 10 times better than it was 5 years ago for the same price is because they make a lot of them, and every time they make more, they get better at it. Learning curve, or a lot of words for it. And the same thing is happening with solar. And let me actually give you some numbers that'll blow your mind. So we think a lot of people, especially people in their 20s, get really excited about nuclear power. It seems like a great solution. If you go to Reddit, I mean, it's just like people love nuclear. Now, the price of nuclear is the only kind of energy where the price has actually gone up in the last 20, 30 years. And there's a lot of, so put some numbers to it. Clinton, guess how many nuclear plants have been built in human history? Take a wild guess.
Oh, 200.
Good guess, 440, right? So they just don't, and they haven't made in the US, they haven't made any in the last 20 years. So there's no experience. They're not getting better at it, right? And every time they make them, it takes 10 years. So they're just not learning and iterating. But think about like natural gas plants, right? There's about 3,000 natural gas plants, and they can make those in factories, to some of them in some ways. And so they're getting better, they're learning, and the price of making natural gas generators is going down a little bit. Now think about what's really gone down. Think about wind turbines, right? Wind has dropped dramatically, and the price of building and installing a wind turbine has gone down dramatically. And all total time, the world has built about 500,000 wind turbines. So you have 1,000 times more experience to take the price of a wind turbine down. It's still a machine. It's not a technology, so it still has a lot of moving parts. It still has a lot of very intense raw materials, so it still has a floor. So wind has gone down a lot. Since they started making solar in high volumes across the world, we have made 120 billion solar cells. So the chance to make more solar cells and learn how to make them, how to reduce the silver, how to make the silicon thinner, how to automate more and more of it so humans don't have to touch it. I didn't talk about it in my book, but I visited a solar factory that makes cells in Europe, and it's the only one that's entirely automated. You have to step aside as robots go by you, but the only people are managing the machines, from raw materials in the trucks coming out to finished solar cells. And then it gets on robots, goes to the second floor of this building, and it puts them in the modules automatically. So you can just continue with all this experience to drive the cost lower and lower. And because the market for silicon is the second most abundant material on Earth, I believe, silver is widely used for other things. It's only like solar's only 10% of silver. So you have these existing supply chains where you can just tap them, and people know we need more silicon, so they just mine more. And it's not pretty, but it works, and the prices go down. The supply chain builds. It's a long answer, but the short answer was we make an awful lot of silicon solar. That's why it's so cheap, and that's why it's going to continue to go down.
Yeah, and that this always kind of brings up this one thing for me because you mentioned it actually. There's a lot of focus on climate change, um, but something I think doesn't should be just as important is the pollution that you
Oh,
you mentioned, and I really think it's incredibly powerful the way it can get into our ecosystems. All the different types of pollution, all the different ways it manifests. Pollution is such a catch-all term. Um, you're close to with your initiative, Solar Inventions. You're talking to people who are designing these, thinking about these companies that are doing this. What are some forward thinking ways that solar panels can be developed so that they're harvestable at the end of life cycles? Like that's something that always comes to mind is like, yeah, there is still a something that's going in the landfill. The pictures of the wind turbine blades of fiberglass that is just like that's so hard to break down and recover because it's just glue. What's some of the technology you've seen that's going to help that?
so I have a big section of one of my chapters on why the solar waste is a completely overblown problem, completely
Okay.
overblown by people that don't want to see solar succeed. And yes, it's a genuine waste problem. But let me tell you why we can deal with it. First of all, if we took all the solar panels we installed this year and we wanted to, in 30, 35 years, they had to be decommissioned, that would be approximately 10% of just the e-waste. So that'd be just 10% of the waste. And that's if you threw the entire thing in a landfill. So that's just 10% next to computers and flat screen televisions and iPhones and everything else. So it's in a stream of e-waste, it's relatively small. And
Right.
e-waste is really a tiny part of overall waste. It's about, it's less than a couple percentage. So if we threw away every single solar panel we ever made, it would be a percent or so of all waste in landfills. So it doesn't excuse it. It needs to be dealt with, but it's a trivial problem compared to much larger, more important problems.
Mm,
As a simple example, the largest waste stream in the world, in the United States, by no close second, is coal ash. Even as coal's diminished around the world, it's still the largest waste stream more than any other, and it's way nastier than solar panels. And you can do stuff with it, but it's harder. Um, but let's get back to solar panels by weight, and this is all in my book and it's on my site. I've gotten and everything I do is cited. Scientific papers. I don't cite any environmental firms or advocates. I cite hardcore science throughout all this. I'll get the numbers a little wrong, but generally, something like 90% by weight of solar panels is aluminum and steel, which is easily and immediately recyclable, which there's existing markets.
hmm
I traveled to France to see a company called Apollon, because I wanted to answer this question that you've asked me, and I wanted to see it personally. This company makes panels that are about maybe 20% more than regular panels, which is not much. And at volume, they think they can match the panels. But these panels take two pieces of glass, and they use a proprietary system with robots, and they suck the air out, and the cells stick inside the glass through air pressure. And because it's all pressure based, rather, they don't need to glue anything. There's no glues. They
Right.
don't need to solder anything. So they're beautiful because you actually see copper, not silver, no tin, no lead, no
Right.
solder. And it's just silicon solar cells and beautiful copper wires. And you know how you recycle them? You take an X-Acto knife and you cut it down the seal, and the solar panels and the wires, the cells and the wires fall on the ground. And you can use them again.
Wow.
And the
I
glass is
mean,
recyclable because you
that
don't
is
need to put the coatings in the plastics. So
yeah.
this is when people ask about the recyclability of solar, um, it's a non-question. It's a
Yeah.
non-question. Now, batteries, I think there is a lot of more legitimate concerns because of the diversity of chemicals used in the processes, but solar panels, it's something to be aware of. And in Europe, for example, if you build a project, I believe you have to put a bond in at the beginning to ensure that there is money at the end of life for it to go and it to be taken care of. But the markets for recycling are getting so big so fast that you won't need the bond. You'll have someone come pick them up and take them and be happy and thank you for it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's such an elegant solution you laid out. Like if you can really put in the work to design it so that it's easily recyclable. That is just it's wonderful. Why wouldn't you? I mean, depending on a lot of this does come down to legislation too. Like before we were throwing bottles and cans onto the side of the road, and then legislation came in, and now littering is taboo in a lot of parts of the world.
Yeah.
And it just takes an initiative, and it takes a cultural shift, and building that into our capitalist framework, being like companies should be responsible for engineering products in that way. That's going to take some work, but once it gets there, it'll just become the default. That ideally, in an ideal
With
world.
solar, it's easy to do. That's the good
Mhm.
news. Some other clean energy technologies, it's harder, but it's and it's it coal and nuclear energy are not the comparison points, but compared to them, it's so easy. It's insane.
Right.
So disposing of waste from coal, nuclear is very hard in different ways. It's the good thing about natural gas is that because there's no carbon tax in the United States, uh, and uh, and there's no the pollution limitations are fairly they're not terribly stringent. So you can just essentially throw away all the waste from natural gas by just sending it into the air, just like we used to do with coal waste
Right.
years ago before it got legislated out with the Clean Air Act.
In writing this book, what was something that you discovered in the research and the traveling and the people you talked to that really surprised you, that really didn't know before? I mean, there's probably a few things, but something that really stands out.
Well, on the negative side, no close second to how bad coal ash
Hmm.
is. So, so back in I think 10, 15 years ago, uh, a coal ash pond. So I don't know if you know what coal ash is, but the coal plant burns coal and it leaves behind this fine ash. And back before the Clean Air Act, they would just send it up the smokestacks. And that was incredibly bad. And even what still gets out is still pretty bad, but it was really bad. So what they did was they would mix it with water and they would stick it out behind the coal plant in a giant ash pond. And there's about 1,000 ash ponds in the United States. And most of them, like 90% of them, and again, I've cited all of this stuff, but you won't find it widely available. You read 10 articles in coal ash, and you won't find this because it's a lot of work to find this source information. You have to go through EPA files and things like that. But 90% of the coal ash ponds are not lined. So that slowly these toxins, cadmium and other things are soaking into the ground slowly. So this is a really big problem. But it gets bigger when a coal ash pond broke and
Hmm.
3,000 acres in Kentucky were covered with billions of gallons of coal ash slurry. And this was the largest environmental disaster in the history of the United States. It was 40 times worse than the Exxon Valdez. It got no press.
Wow.
Everyone's heard of the Exxon Valdez oil, birds covered with oil. You're probably too young for that, but it was for those of my generation, it was a stark memory. A few years later, this happened. No media anywhere.
Yeah.
And the stories get worse from there, and I won't digress into it, but it's a shockingly powerful story of how coal. The U.S. was built. The world is built on coal, and we can't just sort of make it an evil thing. It's coal has built the civilization as we know it, but it became so commonplace that it got away with. For example, the coal 30, 40, 50 years ago, they got coal ash declared as non-hazardous. So people are talking about making solar landfills hazardous. I mean, coal ash is not hazardous according to the
Right.
U.S. EPA. So you can put it anywhere. Now that's
Right.
slowly changing. So that surprised me the most. I think the thing that impressed me the most was just the sheer number of business opportunities that are emerging. And I think probably my biggest insight, an engineer and I'm a closet scientist, and I love reading those articles. And I bet you and people who listen to this I love reading those articles. A new battery technology, a new solar cell configuration that allows for better, efficiency or wattage or something. And they're fun to read because, man, if that really worked, if that got to market, and I think we all fixate on that. The U.S. government loves to fund this this first order science stuff, but my research showed that the businesses that tend to be the most successful and make the biggest impact are what I call second order businesses. They don't make the science breakthrough thing. They buy common products and put them together better than somebody else.
Hmm.
And when people say, oh, I hear you, Bill, but I don't know. I like to point out a little company that people have heard of called Tesla. And Tesla, if you go back and look at the early Model S, which was the breakout car, they didn't have some battery technology that no one had ever invented. They didn't have some chemistry. They didn't have, they wound motors better than had been done before, but there wasn't anything that somebody, 100% of what Tesla had access to in their supply chain had been available for a decade to Ford, GM, Chrysler, BMW, Mercedes. Every single one of those companies had exactly for a decade what Tesla went and picked from. What Tesla did was they put it together in a way better and more uniquely than anyone had ever done. And they created what Car and Driver magazine at the time called the most amazing automobile created in history of automobiles. And Tesla's a lightning rod company, so I'm not going to try to be a fanboy here, but I will tell you that they proved to me beyond a shadow of a doubt that you don't need to invent a better battery. In fact, Tesla, when they first came out, they were using off-the-shelf laptop batteries, if you remember that. And people thought, I mean, Fords and the GMs were like, this is never going to work. You know, this is ridiculous. And yet it worked amazingly. And Tesla created one of the most valuable companies in the history of humanity by taking off-the-shelf parts that Ford and GM and Mercedes had ignored for 10 years. And now they're playing massive catch up.
Wow. So it's reworking what's available and not because to develop new material science is such a long life cycle, such a
Very
long
risky.
development cycle. So that's not really where the fast and most impactful most impact can be made. That makes sense. If you were an engineer today, like the young professionals and engineers watching right now, and I'm going to ask for three. If you could pick three technologies, fields, directions that you would choose as an engineer specifically, what's on your radar?
I mean, there's a lot. In my book, I list out 50 what I think are billion-dollar opportunities, half of which people haven't heard of.
Wow.
But if you wanted me to pick three, my favorite one that's most near term is building integrated photovoltaics. Today, if you think about rooftop solar, it's these giant square rectangles. And if you think about these giant square rectangles, they're actually built for fields. They're built for utility scale solar. And we're just repurposing them without making any changes to stick them on roofs. And there's a whole new generation of products. And I talk about them. I went to Italy to visit one of the top BIPV companies in the country, in the world, and talk about it in the book. And I've talked this week, I've talked to two amazing BIPV companies. So this is about to explode as an industry. And basically, it actually looks like a roof. It looks like
Hmm.
shingles or tiles. But really, it's the stories about the economics. Because, for example, in California, you now have to build solar on the roof in the beginning. But for almost everybody in the world, you build the roof and then you go up back on the roof, you poke holes in it, and then you put solar panels on top.
Right.
And so the easiest form of building integrated photovoltaics is it's just a roof. So you have one layer, by the way, that's usually very insulated, it lasts a lot longer than shingles, and it is your roof. And it just happens to have wires and solar panels in it. And so the total cost goes down because your labor of climbing on the roof is cut in half. And you don't have to buy shingles. And you don't have to replace them every 10 or 15 years like we do in the US. Um, so that's my favorite, just because it's really cool. It's going to create a lot of profitable giant businesses. If you're interested, look at companies like GAF Energy. They just announced new products. They're a leader in this. Tesla's got their solar shingles. They struggled though. It's hard technically. It's something engineering is really helpful for. Hardcore electrical engineering, hardcore materials engineering. That is the gap that will make that when closed will make BIPV incredibly successful. But you can also do it's less effective, but you can do solar windows, solar walls, solar driveways. That's all coming too. That's
I
my
just
first one.
saw I just saw 2 weeks ago I might have been the same company you're mentioning where it's actually um nailable just like
That's the
classic.
one.
That's the one. Yeah, and that's amazing because it doesn't you don't have to retrain a workforce. Well, there's obviously some basic training,
Not a
but
lot.
that's what you need. It's just like make it user friendly. Yeah. Sorry,
And
go ahead.
that company is GAF Energy, and I interviewed their CEO Martin DeBono in my book, and also on my podcast.
Right.
So if that's something that interests people, you can read about what they're doing. Not that latest product, but just the original vision for why they started it. And I think my second one would be, um, I think software, broadly defined software integrated management systems, and it comes in a lot of forms. But in the book, I have this model I call the five orders, and this is I've talked to dozens of venture capitalists, and most people don't think as with as much structure as I think it warrants. So your first order is when you make components, solar cells, solar panels, wind turbines, or wind blades. you build them into something like a Tesla or a wind turbine that's a third or second order. When you create a service out of it, like the grid is a third order business, or pay-as-you-go solar in Africa is the third order business, because you're creating a service from assets. The fourth order is where it really gets interesting, and this is where software starts to come in, where you take existing assets and you put a layer on top of them to turn them into a platform that can then create more value. Now that may sound a little esoteric, but I'll give you the best example, which is Uber and Lyft, right? They don't own any cars. They created massive businesses. People, by and large, love their services, but they own no assets in a business that has historically been entirely about assets. That's a brilliant business. And that same thing is occurring in energy. And the most obvious and immediate example is of virtual power plants, or DERMS, distributed energy resource management systems. And this is kind of wonky, and we can get into it, but this is basically where you take existing assets and you make them run much better, and they create far more value than the sum of their parts. And this is generally, software is the key. So we used to say in the software business that software was eating the world. It took over one industry after the next, and it's now time for software to eat the world when it comes to energy. And I think the next 5 years are going to be incredibly exciting.
Yeah, what Conrad Schmidt, who's our running kind of things behind the scene here, he's doing his PhD in microgrid communication technologies and some of that IoT stuff you talked about earlier. So I know that he could chime in if he had a question about that anytime. But that makes sense. Is a lot about. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit on what those management systems are trying to achieve that we can't do, well, that they're trying to improve?
I'll give you two examples. One is a company I found in the first year of my book research. I wandered into the MIT's incubator in Boston, and I was there to meet a company I'd read about called Hala, and they were doing a microgrid controller. And I'd heard about it, and it's an MIT PhD pair of these guys, and they just exited for a great exit to a big company a couple weeks ago. I was really happy for them, but I talk about them in the book, and I've followed them for years. And they don't just do the typical microgrid control. It's actually a non-deterministic peer-to-peer control system. A lot of advanced math, way over my head, chaos and game theory, and but I went out to one of their large installations and watched them do things that were absolutely magic from a control point of view. And they were so far ahead of the market, because most of the microgrid systems are top-down and deterministic, the same way we run the grid.
Okay.
And so the other story that one of my big inspirations is the Center for Distributed Energy, CDE, here at Georgia Tech. I live in Atlanta, run by a hero of mine, Dr. Deepak Devan, one of the bigger labs on Georgia Tech's campus. And they're working on some of the most cutting edge electricity systems. But one of the things that he and I talk about every time we catch up is that they're really working on a fully autonomous grid. So today the grid, the big grid as I call it, is entirely controlled by inertia, electrical inertia from large spinning power plants. And it works really well. And if you talk to traditional grid people, they will tell you that there's no other replacement for it, which is baloney. But, that's what Thomas Edison and Insull and Westinghouse and Nikola Tesla came up with 120 years ago. It's the exact same system with no change. Keep the frequency in the right range and adjust accordingly based on frequency changes. And so at their lab, they're testing high power stuff where they're actually doing fully autonomous grid nodes. Simple things like inverters for solar panels that are next gen. The NREL is doing a big project on autonomous inverters. They are grid forming rather than grid following. This is probably the only group of people I'll ever talk to that have any idea what I'm talking about. But man, my nerd level goes up on this stuff, because synthetic inertia is so conceptually straightforward, but the power industry, understandably, is very concerned that this won't work and the grid will melt down if you try to do something besides its big spinning reserves and things like that. But a quick story from the book. I shouldn't say from the book, but it is in the book. So I have this crazy vision. I've always had this. I don't know other people do, but I really think it'd be fun to go back in history and get a famous historical character and bring them forward to show them something modern. I think about this all the time, right? And so, like I would love to get the Wright brothers and have them come to 2021, 2022, take them on a 747, drop them at a military air base, and take them on an F-15 and say, look what you've created, right?
Yeah.
And then I want to go and get Alexander Graham Bell, right? At the same time frame, 1920s, 1930s. And I want to say, come forward, look at this iPhone, right? 8 billion of these things today. I can reach any human being on the planet with a 10-digit number. I can access the sum total knowledge of all humanity and history with a couple of taps. Look what you created, right?
Yeah.
But you know what would happen if I went back and got Edison and Tesla? I took them through a substation. It would
They'd
be
be like,
absolutely look identical. If I
yeah,
took them in my book, I've got pictures of a 1920 substation and a 2020 substation. I mean,
right.
I'm sure to someone that does that for a living, they could point out the differences, but structurally, it's a spinning system, 60 hertz, transformers. It's this, nothing's changed. And if you go to a
Yeah.
coal plant, coal plants were 28, 29% efficient. Now they're 30, 32% efficient. They're smarter, but this is still the exact same process for 100 years. So this industry has had no innovation at all. And let me just tell you why there's been no innovation in power. So and again, I did my research, man. You can call bullshit. I don't believe it. Roll your eyes. This is absolutely based on US government data. If you look at all SIC code industries in the United States, car dealerships, massage parlors, retail outlets for chicken, you look at every single SIC code, the lowest R&D of any industry is electric utilities. They spend less
Wow.
money on research than pulp and paper. And they spend less than 0.1% across the United States on research and development. I found two sources for this because I couldn't believe it. Now that's really interesting. That's one of the reasons there's no innovation. They just don't invest in it at all. There's another reason. If you look at, take that same list of all business industries in the United States and rank them by federal lobbying. This is disclosed. It's available from multiple sources. Electric utilities are the third largest federal lobbyists in the United States, behind pharma and forget the other one. And which is kind of crazy because almost all the regulation of utilities is at the state level, almost all of it. And if you're a utility, that's kind of nice because very few states require lobbying disclosures. And so there's a really good chance that electric utilities are the largest lobbyists. They spend more money every year on lobbying than any single other industry in the United States. So think about those two different points, right? So it's hard. It's not surprising that Thomas Edison would look at this and say, you've done absolutely nothing innovative in 120 years. And by
Right.
the way, I go out of my way to make the point to anybody that I think utilities are essential. I think they've done an amazing job. Modern society is built on widely available, universally available, affordable, reliable electric systems. What they've done is nothing short of a miracle, one of the most successful business models in history. But it hasn't changed an iota. And that's kind of what I'm on a mission to do, is to educate people that some change, not a lot, some is needed.
And it seems like you highlighted the problem right there. It's a very imbalanced power dynamic. Forgive the pun. They have, when they're selling something that every single person needs for every single thing they do all day long. The
And
entire
I can't
society
buy from
built on
anyone
it.
else where
And
I
you
live.
can't buy it from anyone else.
I can't. There's no
How,
second company to go to.
there's no motivation to innovate. So if we're sitting at the table at the utility boardroom, why would we ever say let's spend money on innovation?
There's so much history on this. So many American industries were either run by monopolies until those were largely outed by FDR. I've become a fan of histories when I got older. And so there's a lot of lessons there. More recently, the deregulation of natural gas. Airlines used to be fully regulated. Prices were set nationally. And I have charts and graphs that show how the price went down, the cost went down, customer satisfaction went up. And I do talk about the greatest regulated monopoly in U.S. history, which was AT&T, when it was illegal to put a third-party telephone into the telephone jack in your house, and you could only rent it from AT&T. So this was, and eventually, after an epic struggle, AT&T was broken apart, and much of the market was deregulated. And did it help? Pretty sure there'd be no internet without if they had kept it the same. I worked at a consulting firm when one of the big did the Telecommunications Act of '96, and I worked on a team where we looked at the economic impacts of this, and so I saw it firsthand. The internet came out of that. Mobile phones came out of that. So when you open the door to innovation, um, telephone service didn't stop. But so when utility executives sit at the boardroom and say, we don't want to change. In fact, I found in my research, there's a memo that they've since scuttled and hidden, but it's called, it's generally referred to as the grid defection memo, where they said that we as an industry are facing the only threat we've ever had, which is local solar. We've never seen a threat before, and consumers prefer it. It's cheaper, it's better. This could kill us, and they've since buried it. You'd have a hard time finding it. I do have a link from the archive.org.
How do you imagine the transition happening? What is our world going to look like once we start to push past that threshold where enough people start to install their own solar and hook it up into their own panels at home, where the supply and demand gets off kilter? Is it going to happen all like an avalanche, or is it going to happen gradual? I've also seen research that shows that the people who have the least, the most vulnerable people, are going to be the last people to be able to install solar. They're going to be the last people buying energy from the utilities, and supply and demand capitalism dictates that when not enough people are buying, the prices go up. So it's almost like they just get kicked while they're down. So how is that transition going to happen?
That is a very common argument put out by the utilities. They call it the cost shifting argument. They say if wealthy people put solar up, then poor people. So this has been so thoroughly debunked for so many years. And
Please
in my
debunk
book,
me. I want it to be debunked. That's what you're here for.
In my story, again, I have the story of the CEO of AT&T in 1976. Gave a speech publicly, which I can give you the text. And he basically said, if you make us have to compete, it's going to ruin our business. And the consequence is that the cost of telephony is going to become very expensive for low-income people that can't afford the price increase. It is the exact same argument.
Right.
Any of you, and by the way, it wasn't true then. There is an impact. It's kind of like, hey, you know what? I'm driving a car 60 miles down the road, and there's a turn coming up. So let's see, if I make no changes and I cement the steering wheel in place, I might get into an accident, something bad would happen. But I have a thing called a steering wheel and eyeballs, and I can probably make one of 1,000 changes to make sure that when that turn comes, I don't go off the road. It's so easy to avoid the wreck.
Yeah.
And I've been talking. So California is putting out this new proposal, which is a disaster for a new solar tax, basically. And so I spend a lot of my day talking to the experts on this, trying to understand how it came to be and what it means. And what's interesting is that the entire utility industry, electric utility, is based on cost shifts. A much larger cost shift, and I've got the numbers on my site in my book, that when LED bulbs, they actually cause the utilities to lose more money, and they're equally societally impact shifts because LED bulbs are bought predominantly by wealthy people. So you don't hear utilities talking about that.
Right.
You don't talk about the fact that people who live in cities, particularly highly dense urban cities, poorer parts of cities, are 100% subsidizing rural electric customers. So cost shifts occur all over the place. This is a fact of this industry. So why is it that the utility industry is picking on this one single thing that you're aware of? Probably a lot of people listening. Why is that the thing? Why is this cost shift the one that they're concerned about? Because this is the only one where they're losing control.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there is a thing to it. There's a little bit of there. It's real easy to fix. California, for example, already spends more money just subsidizing low-income electricity bills. Just flat out subsidizing it. So they're already spending more money on that. They could continue that. There's just so many ways to address the concern, but they have convinced the regulators successfully in Florida, and I think in California, they're going to do it in Florida again, that this is some horrible social impact. When you actually are on a phone call and you hear the National Resources Defense Council argue with the Sierra Club, and these are people that you can agree with them or disagree with them, but you're going to say that they're always going to agree on things like this. They fight with each other over this. This was a brilliant move by people that wanted to keep the system the same way, to cause friends to fight. And I say to anybody to listen, this isn't about poor people versus rich people. There's a third party in the room. When the money's flowing around, it's the utility itself. And they have done a magnificent job of, no one's asking, well, maybe the utility should put some skin in the game on this. Maybe the utility shouldn't be just as profitable. Why should we be so worried the utilities 100% is profitable through this transition? Maybe they
Yes.
should be, but we're not having that discussion,
Yeah.
right? So this is why I wrote the book, man, because nobody's talking about this stuff. Experts don't talk about this stuff. And I've been there when telecommunications disrupted. I've been there when computing disrupted. I was there when the internet disrupted media. It's one of the few benefits of being old like me. You've seen all this, and the same patterns playing out. There's a lot of differences, of course, but man, this is going to be exciting and a great time for all of you guys who are graduating soon to be in the industry. And by the way, there's a lot of great utilities to go to. So don't hear Nussey says don't go to utilities and work. A great way to learn the industry, but realize that it would be like going to a local radio station when the internet was starting to take off, right? It's just not going to
Right.
have the same prominence that it did before the internet.
And everyone listening and watching, please ask questions if you got them. We can unmute your mic. We've got a few more. We usually like to wrap up at around the hour mark, so we got about 10 more minutes left. I would like to know though, to elaborate on that one last thing you said. What would a utility look like if they were to do this the right way, were to be part of the solution instead of
Some of them are doing it.
Yeah.
The HECO, the Hawaiian Electric, is doing a
Right.
great job, and they're not doing it. They're not excited about it, but because of the unique dynamics of the cost of electricity and the wide availability of solar in Hawaii, they're kind of being forced into it. But they're creating a model. They're making mistakes, but they're creating a model of what the policies look like and the utility of the future looks like. The leaders in Hawaii say there's not enough land and enough places to put wind turbines and solar panels to power the island of Hawaii. But if you start bringing in Hawaiian rooftops, there's more than enough capability to generate all the power the island needs. And they're actually doing stuff about it. But if anyone listening is a hardcore policy interested person, I quote this book all the time, Power After Carbon, by one of the top policy thinkers in the world on this stuff. And he has a model I talk a bit about in the book called a smart integrator. And you can read about it. It's kind of wonky, but it's necessary. And some utilities are accepting this, and they read this book and they're like, "Yep, I got to do it. Don't want to do it. It's been fun being king of the hill, but I've got to play nice with others now." Others are fighting for their lives,
Right.
and throwing lobbying dollars and fake grassroots astroturfing organizations that all over the place. And
Right.
there's a lot of stories about that, just really nasty things like hiring actors to protest, which has happened in New Orleans.
Yeah.
You know how New Orleans went dark after the hurricane went through there?
Right.
The natural gas plant that was supposed to keep it lit didn't work. Well, you go back a little further in history, the utility was caught and fined millions of dollars because they hired actors to go to the Utilities Commission and protest the push towards local solar. And the actors were putting up signs saying we should have a natural gas plant. They were fined a fortune.
Wow. Hasala, you got a question there?
Yes, I do. So Bill, this cost shift problem came into play in the rate case by Duke Energy. I don't know if you followed it. This was a South Carolina Duke Energy rate case in 2018, and they tripled the fixed cost. And in fact, I was a pro se litigant for that case. But from my experience, especially intervening on that, was that there is an ecosystem here. Like it's a rate-based costs, and there is a regulatory commission, there is an office. So should we not think of a systems change instead of having or focusing just on utility? So that is my kind of like, what power does the utility have in this process? Should we not like think of changing the mindset of like the whole system, including the customers?
I think anyone who steps back would 100% agree with you, but it's difficult to change systems. And so again, I looked at history a lot to understand what was going to happen, and systems almost never change themselves, and they never change voluntarily. So what you have to look for is whether there's an externality that will trigger change. And in the case of local energy, there's absolutely a change that's going to trigger this. And the utilities, most of them will be reacting and fighting, but the change will come. And this wouldn't necessarily work in China or different types of governments, but in the US and Canada and other places, You just can't go to the citizens, whether they're whatever their partisanship or their loyalties are, you can't go to them, whatever, and say, you're going to pay twice as much money for your core commodity, in this case electricity, just to make sure that some very large company remains very happily profitable. And the only reason we're not having that discussion today is because no one knows that's the trade-off.
Right.
Most citizens have everyone loves rooftop solar, but they don't understand that the economics of it are trapped in this broken system. And so I make the case to people, say, listen, if you don't want net meter, if the utility doesn't want net metering, they don't want to do this, then all they have to do is let me sell my solar to my neighbor. Then it's all fine. Because my neighbor will pay me the retail rate for solar. They'll pay me whatever they pay the utility. I know what the market rate for my electricity is. So if you're a utility, you either pay full-scale net metering, or you let me buy and sell electricity my own way, like you can do in Japan and Europe and many places in Japan and many places in Europe. But you can't have both. And that's and they have both today. And so as soon as we're allowed to sell to each other, which is probably not going to happen in the US anytime soon, then all these questions will be moved. But here's the last thing why it's going to go away. The reason net metering, for the few people that don't know what it is, it's what the utility pays you for your excess electricity. And you typically can't use all the electricity. Maybe your air conditioning's not running, but your solar panels are on full tilt. You send it back to the grid. So the more the utility pays you for that, the faster you pay off your solar panels. And in many cases, most cases in the US, they pay you what you pay them. It's like your meter runs backwards. They don't want to do that anymore. And so, anyway, I forgot where I was going with that, but it's the changes that can come by as soon as I can sell to each other. All that floats, all of this static system with defines inputs and outputs goes away, melts away, and then you have a market.
And there's still a huge and profitable and very appetizing market right there for maybe maybe utilities in the future will be more of a distribution heavy thing and less of a generation heavy thing.
Look more like eBay.
Yeah, I still can't go out into my back alley and put up a power pole and a transformer and distribute it, right? So utility still has a lot of skin in the game. They just need to shift their philosophy of what they're providing.
And I think you're going to look like eBay, where people buy and sell things, the kilowatts and stabilization and emergency backup and the whole suite of services that will be aggregated for us by some new generation of companies that doesn't exist, and the Googles and Apples of the new energy age. And they're going to say, pay this bill and we'll take care of all of it for you. Right. It's an exciting time. In the US, I think it's going to be the hardest to get it done, but I'm excited. It's if you want to get into this now, just go to Europe. They're doing it. They have these things called energy communities. I'm doing I'm following it, looking at it closely. I think there's some great models where people are going to be pioneering this. Sadly, the US will be behind, but it'll happen.
The US does seem like it's behind and also overwhelmed at the same time right now. Are the utilities beholden to the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission? Because like right now, it seems like there's so many different monopoly cases that are in the news all the time with tech. They barely are able to address any of the big mergers and monopolies, and it's like the pending cases just building and building. And I mean, are utilities even on the radar as far as what's going to get the senators voted next year? You know,
I mean, ever since before the Civil War, Americans have hated trusts and monopolies. You know, we don't like a single company controlling the market. So, you know, up through and until FDR, there was just decades of trust busting, and the giant sugar and railroad and other monopolies were taken apart.
Right.
And only one monopoly remained, which was electricity. Well, there's a couple others, but the main one that remained by scale was electricity. And the reason it got locked in place was this guy, Sam Insel, who a lot of people haven't heard of, but is amazing character in history. He convinced the US and FDR to make utilities the exception, to make electricity the exception, and he locked in regulated monopolies. And so there's very little discussion that I'm aware of, certainly not from an SEC monopoly point of view, about that structure. But I think that market forces, low cost solar, and that's what I was going to say earlier. The solar is getting super cheap, but so are batteries. And so when batteries get cheap enough, and in some places like Hawaii and other, it's already there, you don't care what net metering is at all, because you're going to use every bit of solar you generate. So you don't care what the utility pays you for it. And so when utilities in California and Southeast where I live are fighting this kind of thing, they're just fighting the inevitability, because when solar and batteries are cheaper than their electricity, which in some places is now and other places a couple of years from now, I don't need net metering. And that's why the utilities in California are trying to tax even owning solar panels. They're trying to get in the door to make it uneconomic whether you have batteries or not. But listen, we saw what happened in Arizona and other places where they came out with these really nasty policies, and people just in Hawaii, other places, once people figured out what was going on, once the consumer advocates got their fur up and they got their marches going, it was all overturned. The utilities can pull the wool over the eyes for a little while, but it doesn't last. So it's really a question of whether it delays it for 3 or 4 or 5 years. And I just also want, I mean, one of the people I interviewed was the chairman of PG&E, right? This was a great guy. I respected him. He was a solid business person. He'd come from outside. He's not there anymore. He was the interim chairman until he got the team that's in there now. And he was someone I respected in every way. And he understood what was going on, and he was trying to change it. But it's a very difficult situation to change. He said, if you want to change utilities, you've got to start with the regulators. Utilities can do nothing without the regulators. And you create this system, and it has all these perverse incentives.
Yeah,
and that's what we got to fix. So ultimately, it's up to us, everyone listening. Get educated, vote. You know, like in Georgia, we can vote for our public utility commissioners. We can actually vote for them. 13, 18 states, you can do that. So get involved. That's how you change it. It works.
Yeah. As a final question, a two-parter to elaborate on that. If you could wave a magic wand and tomorrow change a regulation, what regulation would you change? And second part, if you could wave a magic wand and bring about a technological advancement, what are those two things a regulatory change and a technological change, and then that'll be it for us tonight.
I love those questions. I think about them. I think about this esoteric stuff. The two answers for the regulatory one. If I could just have everything in a steady state, I would just want a competitive market for electricity like you have in Australia.
Sure.
Even more than that, right? But it takes a while to get there, and it's so if I wanted to have a stepwise intelligent transition towards this future of transactional energy and competitive energy, I would make it perfectly legal to put the meter at the head of my neighborhood instead of my house, the head of my campus or the head of my business business campus or whatever. But so I could allow people to buy and sell electricity behind the meter with each other. And that creates thousands, millions of sandboxes for people to try the new technologies and the software and the equipment and the pricing policies. And all the utility does is when asked, they deliver electricity into it, but they no longer have the control of every end user. They no longer have to have a connection to every end user, which is how it is in most places. There's certainly exceptions to that in the US and other places. By and large, they have to own the end connection. No one can make a market internally. So I'd move the meter up the feeder, as I call it, move the meter up the feeder. And I think that'd be small. And you could start with sort of 1 megawatt behind the meter transactional and go to 10 megawatt. This is exactly what Europe's doing. It's not hard, it's working. The next thing on the technology thing, you know, I would jump batteries 3 or 4 years faster. But it's so exciting right now. I really don't feel I can ask for more than the scientists and policymakers. And good thing about batteries is all political stripes like batteries. It's kind of a funny thing, but everyone likes batteries. The United States is thankfully for Tesla, but besides that, way behind the world in battery manufacturing. But that's changing quickly. And so I think batteries are the next area. I wish they would hurry up and get solid state batteries to actually work. And for one very specific reason. It's not because light EVs are lighter weight. It's because they have more. They should have more cycle times. So a typical EV battery cycle 2,500, 3,500 times, and it loses your driving range. Theoretically, the solid state stuff I've looked at, 10,000, 15,000, 25,000. Why does that matter? Well, first of all, the car, as Elon Musk talks about, will last 1 million or 3 million miles. That's a big deal, right? But the reason it's much more interesting is that if we go out in 10 years, there's going to be more aggregate storage in vehicles than there is going to be in everything on the grid and in your house. And if we can tap into that, Now, the reason I interviewed an executive from Tesla and I said, how come you don't do V2G? How come you don't do two-way with your battery? And he said, off the record, so I can't name who it was, but he said, people's batteries will wear out faster. They'll be less happy with the car.
Yeah.
But now all the new manufacturers of cars, Ford 150 famously, the Lightning, they're all making V2G part of the core spec. Tesla will certainly follow suit, and their batteries will probably last longer than anybody's. And so all of a sudden, you've got this battery resource available to the grid. It's going to accelerate the solution to the intermittency of wind and solar in a way. And you talk to people in the industry, and you're like, they'll look at you as straight-faced. You can't imagine how complicated it would be to organize and orchestrate all these thousands, tens of millions of individual people acting individually. It's not possible to build a system that works that way. And I just look at them and I say, internet, Wikipedia, Google data center, every cloud data center, the entire last 10 years, 20 years has been defined by hard science at managing hugely disparate in each individual node, unreliable, to aggregate into high reliability. There's no doubt that when we get to that state, the grid will be far more reliable than it's already high reliability. So, I love to see these things as systems. So if we can have batteries that last 10,000 cycles, everything I just talked about becomes possible almost overnight.
Yes.
It's exciting times, man.
Exciting outlook. And for everyone watching today, I didn't mention at the beginning, but looking at that book behind you, Bill wanted to give the participants a gift today. If you go onto our LinkedIn page, which you can find, it's on the flyer, after this discussion, anytime in, let's say, the next week, and just join the conversation, start a conversation, keep things going on there. We'll put all your names in a draw, and Bill's going to give away a free signed copy, hard copy, two of them to two people who participate in the conversation. And Bill, you're on LinkedIn too, so if they tag your name there, so you can join in. So
yeah, if you want to continue this discussion or ask questions, I will monitor this, and whoever, I'll give the second book to whoever has the best discussion.
Nice.
And I will randomly pick the first one and give the second one to the best discussion. And yeah, so love to continue the dialogue. This is such an exciting time, and it is a true privilege. When Clinton and I were talking about this, it was Clinton felt like he was asking a huge favor, and it was kind of awkward. Like, do you think he would do this? And I was like, heck yeah. I mean, you guys have the right expertise at the right time at one of the most exciting transitions in human history. I mean, hey, listen, I graduated at EE a long time ago. Wasn't so hot to be at EE, but this is going to be a fun time. You guys are in for an exciting 10 years, and I would love to be one of those voices you remembered. I heard something once. Maybe I should look at this and maybe go change the world.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, best of luck on your journey with this book. And thank you for joining us. It was really interesting. You brought an angle that we hadn't really had before. You really so much knowledge about the business and the regulatory side that not really many of our guests had brought. So that was really great, and we appreciate that. And thank you, Hasala and Conrad and Priya and Shani, for always backing me up. I could not do this without them. And thank you all, the panelists, the attendees. You guys, please join in, participate. We'll see you all next time. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, guys.
Okay. Good night, everybody.